Well, how is it that India was able to cement this success? How is it that Prime Minister Modi and the Indian diplomacy was able to get different conflicting sides or the warring factions to agree to a joint statement? Many said that it was an impossibility. There were critics who were arguing that the fact that the Russians and the Chinese head of the state are not present for the summit could be a dampener. Putting all of that criticism aside, this summit has been a historic success. How has this success been achieved? And how did we cement it? Joining us on the broadcast is our very special guest. We have Dr. Jitendra Singh, the Union Minister, joining us on the broadcast. Sir, good evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin by talking about this immense success of G20. India gave a message of one world, one family, inclusive growth and development, and the manner in which it has been reflected across different platforms, whether it's a joint statement, bilaterals, or different deals that have been talked about, it has been a story of historic success. How do you see this success? What is the idea behind it? What led to this big success?
I think my very first thought is that it is an extension of what the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji had envisaged, and what he also said in his remarks yesterday. There's a need to transform global trust deficit into global trust. And it's a matter of pride that Prime Minister Modi has been an instrument of creating that kind of global trust, which has enabled this unanimous agreement. And India G20, I would rather put it in a single sentence, saying that it symbolizes inclusiveness in its best form. Is true to the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which you were referring. It's also true to Modi mantra of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas. And it's been a statesmanly lead taken by India by way of, for example, including African Union into G20, now converting G20 into G21. And as we move on in the course of conversation, I think most important, what has personally also given me a sense of great delight and pride, is the Bharat, Middle East, Europe corridor that has been agreed upon, which is something which was possibly not contemplated or even visualized till a few years ago.
Absolutely. You've raised a lot of issues, so I want to tackle them one by one. You spoke of public trust. The fact that the Global South has been able to find its voice like never before on a platform like G20, and India has been leading that conversation, that discourse on multiple platforms, including G20. How do you see that trust building up at an international level on the leadership of the Prime Minister, on the leadership of the present government, the commitment of the present government to the sustainable development goals, inclusive growth, not just here in India, but across the world?
Of course, now converting G20 to 21 is itself an achievement behind which not much of effort has gone in. Which is because in the diplomatic parleys, everything is not made public before the time happens to do so. But there's not much of effort gone down by the Prime Minister himself and also the team inspired by him. Now, as far as including all the nations, as you mentioned, is concerned, I said, as I said in my opening remarks, G20 India is one of the finest examples of inclusiveness in its best form. And I think that is also reflected in the manner in which the joint declaration or the Delhi declaration was not evasive. It didn't mince words. It was forthright, frank, honest, and yet it was meaningful. And I think that is best reflected in reference to the Ukraine conflict or the Ukraine war, under the subheading Planet, People, Peace, Prosperity. So under the subhead of Planet, People, Peace, Prosperity, you would, if you go through that keenly, you would realize that G20 does very modestly admit that the resolution of a conflict situation or a war or a geopolitical contradiction is not its mandate. G20's mandate primarily is to act as a forum for international cooperation. But yet it is indulging because, for very important reasons, that the human beings tend to suffer.
Absolutely.
In the aftermath of any conflict situation or in the aftermath of war, just as they also suffer in the aftermath of a pandemic like we experience in COVID. And therefore the declaration also makes it very candidly assertive that we are highlighting human suffering and the negative impacts of war regard to the global food, energy, supply chains, etc., which tend to get adversely affected, and therefore in a way a situation like this also would end up causing economic distress, and taking cognizance of the concerns related to economic well-being of the population is important mandate of G20, and therefore it very wisely, very diligently also justifies its indulgence without making it appear that it is interfering into any kind of a geopolitical controversy.
Sir, you very rightly point out the humanitarian approach that G20 as a platform has taken. And it also resonates with the Indian foreign policy position that India had taken vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Many Western nations wanted us to take a very strong position when that conflict had begun or few months into that conflict. But India was very clear in terms of its approach. While we remain quote-unquote neutral in many ways, when it came to humanitarian aid or extending any kind of relief to the people who were suffering in the war, India was one of the first countries to come forward. The manner in which G20 resolution was adopted or that joint statement could be agreed upon is a reaffirmation of India's position. Do you see that as world agreeing that we need to take a far more humane approach when it comes to this particular war or crisis?
Of course, to sum up what you are saying in a single sentence, there's a expression used: today's era must not be that of war.
Yeah.
Today's era must not be that of war, which is also used in the Bali Declaration earlier. So that is how the G20 declaration connects itself or its concerns to the possibilities of distress being caused economically and socially to the world population, and thereby it addresses the issue of conflict not as somebody who's come forward to act as an arbitrator. So that is one aspect. The other part is connecting the same, and I'm sure you'll maybe taking up in the next question. This corridor thing actually has been very, it's put me nostalgically back to the Kabuliwala days, because that is something which the post-partition India would have, always looked for. It must have been the quest of the population, which has seen the aftermath of the partition happening, when about 10 to 20 lakh people got killed. Twice the number of them went homeless, and suddenly Pakistan comes in, and then vetoes are a request to overfly the zone. So the entire corridor gets cut off, which was actually a route of trade in the pre-partition days.
Sure.
So I think that's a huge restoration of a historical situation which had been somewhere got deranged in the agony and tragedy of the biggest exchange of population and the biggest partition that is known in the recent history of the world. And again, Prime Minister Modi will be credited for a long time for having introduced this concept of what is now being popularly described as the Bharat Middle East Europe corridor.
True, very true. And let me take the cue for the next question from there, as you said. India, one of the richest civilizations in the world historically for centuries, has always been a very important destination when it comes to trade and economic activity. Talking about nostalgia, the Silk Route or various historical facets will point out how India has been a significant country, an important power when it comes to furthering trade, prosperity, and also cooperation between these different countries. But many talk about the messaging to the Chinese. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is often seen as antithetical, as something which is not very good for the sovereignty of many countries. There are various criticisms around that Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see this particular corridor as an alternative to the Chinese model?
Yeah, there are two aspects to it. One that you are referring to, the strategical aspect. So strategically, I think this decision addresses the issue twofold. A, the concern about Chinese connectivity projects. From time to time you get to know or you get to hear about Chinese, working on some design. So that is part A. The second part is it also eliminates that Pakistan's veto by which it would refuse you to allow overland access and thereby cause you tremendous hardship. So that is the strategy part. But of course, going back to the trade, Of course, as you rightly mentioned, the pre-partition times, the early 20th century, when we had this Silk Route, that of course, but in addition to that, over the last 70, 80 years, with the turn of the century, there are new dimensions to the trade. And now, as you would recall, Europe had committed itself to spend as much as 300 million euros from the year 2021 to 27. So I think this will also facilitate, this corridor will facilitate that kind of European investment in infrastructural development along that corridor, whether it be the formation of in the form of laying down of rail tracks or putting in place shipping connectivity or even the optic fibers.
Sure.
And it's going to have besides the trade, it's also, I'm sure, going to have effect on periodic temperatures rising in the form of some insurgency pockets appearing in this zone. Because the more the connectivity in the Arabian Peninsula, I think more the prospects of disturbances of geopolitical nature also tending to remain under somewhat reasonable control.
Sure, sure. So coming back to the agenda of inclusive growth and what India has to offer, the success of Chandrayaan-3 is an example how with limited resources Indians can do so much, and that's an example that the entire world has very keenly watched. Another thing that invoked a lot of interest at G20, and it was much talked about, is the kind of digital payment infrastructure India has been able to create with very limited resources, the deep penetration of it despite limited spending capacity of the Indians. When it comes to these examples, these models of growth and inclusiveness, do you think there's an example that the rest of the world can follow, the developed and the developing countries?
I'm sure. I think India has emerged as a role model. I mean, this is, as someone who is connected with the Ministry of Space, this is a question being asked day in and day out. Even during the G20 summit, most of the delegates were keen to understand how could we manage Chandrayaan at a cost of just 600 crore vis-a-vis the Russian mission, which was 16,000 crore, yet not successful as they had planned it to be. And that is because we have tried to make up for the financial resources through our cerebral resources. Lot much of diligence, lot much of brain work in strategizing our technology missions has been invested. So, like for example, even if you take the case of Chandrayaan, it was when it took off from here, it took the advantage of the gravitational forces, spent a lot of time, 10-20 times going around the Earth, in the orbit of Earth. Then finally it went into the lunar orbit, and then it was almost as much as about 40 circles around the moon. So we were in a way saving on fuel by strategizing our itinerary, though it took a little longer. So I think that is why I have now been saying this with a certain amount of conviction for quite some time, that India never lacked acumen, never lacked potential, never lacked the human resource, even in those days when we were devoid of resources complete. Now, of course, with Prime Minister Modi having come in, there's much of investment happening in technology endeavors. We have the private sector opening up. The space, for example, has been opened up to all the stakeholders. We have as much as more than 150 startups. We have this Anusandhan National Research Foundation, which is going to give room to investment of as much as 60-70% from the non-government sources. All this has happened in the recent times with the path-breaking decisions taken by Prime Minister Modi. But even in those days when we were devoid of all this, we were not devoid of the human resource.
Sure.
And I think that's what makes us create these role models of cost-effective technology experiments. And also because we are a heterogeneous country, and we have learned to apply these technologies in heterogeneous conditions. Like for example, our Swamitva program, one of the finest examples, again being emulated by the world over, is being talked about, because you no longer need to access the revenue officers. You can map your farm, map your land. It's all space technology. Similarly, your DBT. Now, just remember, this Digital India was announced by Prime Minister Modi long before COVID happened, and nobody could foresee that COVID was in the offing. But when COVID actually happened, this proved to be a boon. So we were at an advantage compared to several other nations, because we had already created a means, a mechanism by which we could transfer the money, even when the supply chains or the other mechanisms had faltered because of the COVID or had gone berserk because of the pandemic.
True, true. You've said this in public domain and on social media that India is no longer the lesser cousin. You said this in context of space research and technology, and I argue that this holds true also on the global platform. I mean, there are various superpowers that run this world and the geopolitics of this world, but the soft power of India has proved to be highly persuasive.
Absolutely, and I have no hesitation once again to give credit to Prime Minister Modi. He made the countrymen realize the power of soft power. The power of soft power. And when I say we are no longer lesser cousins, it does have a literal meaning in the sense I tell you.
Yeah.
I'll give you a scientific reason for why I say so. Till about few years back, we were not at the same pace, at the same level as other nations as far as technology advancement is concerned. And the two most notable examples are that of television and computers, which happened in this country nearly 1.5 decades later. Now, for example, America had television in 1950s. Their presidential elections, the most famous presidential election of 1960 when Kennedy turned the tables on Nixon through a TV debate, was primarily because of a television debate. But we had never heard of debate of a television happening in those days. We got it in somewhere in 70s, that too in the form of a short-term chitrahar or some kind of a weekly program. So also was the case of computers.
Sure.
But now today, for example, take the case of National Quantum Mission. We are one of the few nations we are into quantum technology in the R&D in the same level.
Yeah.
Space, we are at the same level. So gone are the days when we would take lead or we would follow others or others would have developed the technology, applied it, and the technology would become popular there, and then the thought would occur to us to also to adopt it and to realize its merits and advantages or benefits. It's no longer so. In fact, we are sometimes ahead of others in applying certain technologies which they then pick up. And yes, again, the example is that of space technology. Today we are applying, unlike many other countries, our space technology is not only confined to the sending up of rockets. We are using it in the building of smart cities, in laying down of rail tracks, in roads, buildings, in telemedicine, of course, in agriculture sector in a big way, which is not happening in many other countries. So we are actually now laying down cues and leads for others to follow. Therefore, I said we have the confidence to say we are no longer lesser cousin.
We are no longer the lesser cousin. I agree with that, sir. Today is not the day to talk about the critics or the naysayers, but I want to indulge you into this conversation and this particular question. Many argue that G20, would it be a success or not? The Russian and the Chinese, the head of the state, are not here for the G20 summit. Is this a snub of some sort? And the success of the entire summit was doubted upon. The kind of consensus that has been achieved under the leadership of India at the G20 forum, the kind of key agendas that have been put on the table, various bilateral trade agreements that have been talked about. What would you say to the critics of the government who were not so sure or certain of the success of the summit?
I think again they are not able to understand the kind of craftsmanship that India has come to acquire over the years.
Yeah.
So they are still looking, some of them still looking at India through the prism of yesterday, as I said. And many of us within the country also are still victims of that hangover, the colonial hangover. Even in our scriptures, it is said that it takes 3 generations to change. तीन पीढ़ियों के बाद संस्कार बदलता है. So we are still to get out of that mindset that it's no longer the India which was, taken for granted and which was looked down upon. For example, till a few years ago, the issues like climate concern, the issues like biofuel. We have today, I think that's one other achievement of this summit. It is India which has taken a lead and the initiative to form a biofuel alliance, which is going to be the alliance of the future,
sure,
the alliance of the 21st century for the rest of the 75 years. We have a huge biofuel resource. It is we who are telling the world now. So I think it's for us also and for the critics also to come out of the prism of yesterday and to start looking at India through the prism of today and maybe even tomorrow.
Absolutely. That's very well said. Dr. Jitendra Singh, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.